Chuck Liddell, the Iceman who once stood as the face of the UFC, has reportedly just been rushed to the ER, according to circulating rumors. Details are scarce, his team remains silent, and fans are left in shock, wondering if the fighter who once seemed untouchable is now facing his toughest battle outside the cage. Later in this video, we'll break down everything we know about his current condition. But first, we need to go back. To truly understand how Chuck Liddell reached this tragic moment, we must revisit the career, the highs, the brutal falls, and the choices that brought him here. Before Chuck Liddell became the Iceman, the face of UFC knockouts, he was just a kid from Santa Barbara, California. Born on December 17, 1969, Liddell grew up in a working-class family, raised primarily by his mother and grandfather after his father left early in his childhood. His upbringing was tough, and like many kids searching for identity in the 1970s, he often found himself scrapping in the streets. Fighting wasn't just a hobby, it was survival. At 12 years old, Liddell's grandfather introduced him to Koei-kan karate. The discipline of martial arts struck a chord in young Chuck. He was relentless, training barefoot on hard wooden floors, learning not just how to strike, but how to endure. By high school, he added wrestling to his arsenal, competing with grit and toughness rather than refined technique. It was here that his nickname, the Iceman, first began to make sense. Not because he was cold-hearted, but because he never seemed rattled. No matter how intense the fight, his expression never changed. His eyes stayed icy, his jaw tight, his composure unbreakable. College took him to Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo, where he wrestled at the Division I level. But wrestling wasn't enough. He sought out striking disciplines, dabbling in kickboxing, and eventually pursuing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu under John Hackleman, who would become his lifelong coach. Liddell's training routine became brutal. Long runs in the California heat, endless sparring, and a dedication to conditioning that made him a machine. He wasn't the most naturally gifted athlete, but he compensated with a willpower that few could match. By the late 1990s, Liddell had pieced together the skills of a modern mixed martial artist before MMA itself was mainstream. He had the karate base, wrestling grit, kickboxing power, and a deepening knowledge of grappling. He was perfectly built for the chaos of cage fighting. And when he debuted in the UFC in 1998, fans immediately noticed his icy demeanor and his devastating right hand. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't loud, he was stoic, calculated, and terrifying. But those early years were lean. UFC wasn't yet the global powerhouse it would become. Fighters often competed for pennies compared to today's million-dollar paydays. Liddell fought for pride, for the love of combat, and for the chance to make a mark in a sport still struggling to find mainstream respect. He stacked up wins, his reputation growing as one of the most feared strikers in the sport. His mohawk, tattoos, and steel-eyed stare made him unforgettable. Yet, beneath the stoicism was a man shaped by hardship, carrying emotional scars from his father's absence and the weight of proving himself in a brutal new sport. Even as he rose, the seeds of future struggles, injuries, concussions, and financial instability were already being planted. And while he would soon become the UFC's first mainstream star, the price of that spotlight would haunt him long after the lights faded. By the early 2000s, Chuck Liddell was becoming more than just another fighter. He was evolving into the UFC's first true superstar. His ice-cold stare at weigh-ins, the mohawk, the tattoos across his scalp, and his reputation for brutal knockouts made him stand out in an era when MMA was still finding its identity. While fighters like Randy Couture embodied the traditional martial artist's discipline, Liddell represented something raw, violence with precision. He built his reputation one knockout at a time. His right hand carried thunder, and his granite chin made him fearless in exchanges. Victories over opponents like Kevin Randleman, Murilo Bustamante, and Vitor Belfort cemented his place among the elite. But it was his rivalry with Randy Couture that defined the UFC's early boom. Their trilogy was iconic. Couture first out-wrestled him, but Liddell came back in the rematch with a thunderous knockout to capture the light heavyweight title. That knockout didn't just win him gold, it crowned him the UFC's poster boy. As champion, Liddell was unstoppable. He defended his belt against Jeremy Horn, then twice against his arch-rival Tito Ortiz. The Ortiz fights were personal. Ortiz had been the UFC's previous face, brash and cocky, and their feud was electric. When Liddell knocked him out and then dominated him in a rematch, the passing of the torch was complete. Chuck Liddell was now the undisputed king of the UFC. From 2005 to 2007, Liddell reigned at the very top. His knockouts weren't just wins, they were cultural moments. Fans tuned in specifically to see how fast he could end a fight. His icy stare and finger point before bouts became iconic images that defined the UFC's rise to mainstream popularity. Pay-per-views sold in record numbers, sponsors lined up, and suddenly MMA was on television and in households that had never cared about cage fighting before. But with fame came a different lifestyle. Liddell wasn't just a fighter anymore. He was a celebrity. He appeared on TV shows, walked red carpets, and partied with movie stars. His stoic, icy cage persona transformed outside the Octagon into a man who embraced fame, money, and excess. The spotlight was intoxicating, but it also distracted. Training camps weren't as intense as before. Nights out became longer. The hunger that once fueled his rise began to blur beneath the glitz of being the UFC's face. Yet, during these years, fans didn't see the cracks. All they saw was dominance, the Iceman knocking out legends, the UFC finally thriving, and a sport finding its first global icon. But the truth was, every knockout victory was hiding a reality. Chuck Liddell's chin, the foundation of his fighting style, was eroding. Years of absorbing shots, years of wars were taking their toll. And soon, that invincible aura would be shattered in the most brutal fashion imaginable. By the mid-2000s, Chuck Liddell wasn't just a UFC champion, he was the UFC champion. His mohawk, his goatee, the ice-cold stare before fights, and that signature finger point became symbols of an era. When fans thought of mixed martial arts, they thought of the Iceman. The UFC itself leaned on him heavily, marketing him as the knockout artist who could carry the sport into mainstream culture. And it worked. Between 2005 and 2007, Liddell became a pay-per-view king. His knockout victories weren't just wins, they were events. His rematch with Randy Couture ended with a highlight reel KO that played endlessly on sports networks. His first fight with Tito Ortiz sold over 1 million pay-per-views, a landmark for the company at the time. When he dismantled Ortiz again in their rematch, the torch was firmly passed. Liddell wasn't just the UFC's biggest star, he was a pop culture icon. Hollywood came calling. Liddell made appearances in films, guest starred on television, and became the UFC's first fighter to truly cross over into mainstream entertainment. He appeared on talk shows, graced magazine covers, and mingled with celebrities at red carpet events. For a fighter who once struggled to pay rent, it was the pinnacle of validation. The Iceman had arrived. Inside the cage, his aura was unmatched. Opponents entered already intimidated, knowing Liddell's hands could end their night with one clean shot. He wasn't known for flashy submissions or wild spinning kicks. He was known for walking you down, planting his feet, and throwing bombs until you fell. His chin seemed indestructible, his will unbreakable. Fans loved it. Casuals loved it. Sponsors loved it. But what fans didn't see was the cost. Training camps became less disciplined. Nights out became more frequent. Stories began surfacing of Liddell partying during camps, showing up to appearances looking worn out. His focus split between fighting and celebrity life. His iron chin, which had carried him through countless wars, was slowly degrading. His reflexes dulled. He was taking more punishment in sparring, even if the public didn't see it yet. In hindsight, this was the golden era of Chuck Liddell's career, but also the beginning of his slow undoing. He was at the very top, living the dream, basking in glory. But with every fight, every party, every late night, the Iceman's armor was thinning. He didn't see it yet. The fans didn't see it yet, but soon the cracks would open wide, and the same aura that made him untouchable would collapse in the most brutal way possible. The fall of Chuck Liddell was as shocking as his rise was exhilarating. From 2007 onward, the Iceman's career took a turn that no one expected. It began with Quentin "Rampage" Jackson at UFC 71. Liddell, then the reigning light heavyweight champion, entered the cage with his usual icy confidence. But just a minute into the first round, Rampage landed a massive right hand that sent Liddell crashing to the canvas. The Iceman was out cold. The knockout stunned fans. For the first time in years, Liddell looked human. Many brushed it off as a bad night. Surely the Iceman would recover, but what followed was a pattern of devastating knockouts that revealed something far more troubling. Liddell's legendary chin was gone. In 2008, he was knocked out by Rashad Evans in brutal fashion. The highlight replay showed Liddell stiff before he even hit the canvas, a haunting image that replayed endlessly on sports channels. Then came Mauricio "Shogun" Rua, who finished him viciously in 2009. And finally, Rich Franklin in 2010, who landed a crushing hook that once again sent Liddell to the mat unconscious. It wasn't just the losses, it was the way they happened. The man who once walked through punches now fell with every clean shot. His aura of invincibility was shattered. Fans who once cheered for highlight knockouts now watched with horror as their hero was on the receiving end. Even Dana White, who loved Liddell like family, admitted he couldn't bear to watch him take more punishment. He begged him to retire. Outside the cage, the signs of damage were visible. Liddell's speech grew slower, his movements less sharp. Interviews revealed a man who had absorbed too much punishment in too short a time. The partying lifestyle, combined with years of wars inside the Octagon, had caught up with him. The Iceman was no longer the predator, he was the prey. In 2010, Dana White announced that Chuck Liddell was officially retired, placing him in a UFC executive role to keep him financially stable and close to the sport. But for Liddell, retirement wasn't easy. Fighters don't just walk away from the adrenaline, the cheers, and the identity of being a warrior. He struggled to adapt to a life outside the cage, and while fans remembered him as a legend, the image of him unconscious on the canvas lingered. The sudden decline of Chuck Liddell wasn't just about losing fights, it was about losing himself. The Iceman, who once terrified opponents, now looked fragile, exposed, and vulnerable. And as the years went by, it became clear that the damage done in those brutal knockouts wasn't going away. It was only getting worse. When Dana White forced Chuck Liddell into retirement in 2010, it wasn't out of spite. It was out of mercy. White admitted publicly that he couldn't stand to see his friend and former champion take another knockout. The UFC gave Liddell an executive role, a comfortable paycheck to keep him financially stable, while still tied to the company he had helped build. On the surface, it was the perfect ending. A Hall of Fame induction, a job in the front office, and a legacy cemented. But Liddell didn't adapt well to life outside the cage. Fighters rarely do. The adrenaline of walking out to thousands of screaming fans, the high of victory, the clarity of purpose, all of that vanished overnight. Liddell was now a retired athlete at 40 years old, trying to fill a void that nothing else could match. He appeared at conventions, signed autographs, and attended UFC events, but it wasn't the same. He was a warrior forced to watch others fight battles he still craved. Then came the financial strain. Despite earning millions during his peak years, Liddell's spending habits, coupled with divorce proceedings and the costs of maintaining his lifestyle, reportedly ate away at his fortune. The celebrity lifestyle, parties, appearances, and Hollywood cameos didn't provide the same stability as his fighting days. By the mid-2000s teens, rumors swirled that Liddell was struggling to keep up with expenses, relying heavily on public appearances and signing gigs to make ends meet. The UFC executive role didn't last either. When the company was sold in 2016 to WME-IMG, Liddell was one of several former fighters let go from cushy front office jobs. Suddenly, the financial cushion Dana White had set up was gone. Now in his mid-40s, Liddell was left with no steady income and no fighting career to fall back on. Behind the scenes, the damage from his career was catching up with him too. Former training partners noticed his speech was slower, his reactions dulled. The toll of the knockout losses and years of sparring were visible. But Liddell, always stoic, never admitted weakness. He smiled for the cameras, signed gloves for fans, and pretended everything was fine. In truth, the Iceman was struggling with money, struggling with identity, struggling with the gnawing hunger to fight again, even as his body and brain begged him not to. For fans, the image of Chuck Liddell during this time was bittersweet. The Hall of Famer, still beloved, still respected, but beneath the surface, the reality was far darker. And in 2018, that reality would come crashing into the spotlight in the most painful way possible. By 2018, Chuck Liddell was nearly a decade removed from his last fight. He was 48 years old, well past the age when most fighters hang up the gloves. His chin had betrayed him years earlier, and his legacy was already secure. Yet the hunger never left him. When Golden Boy Promotions announced they were entering MMA, they dangled an offer in front of Liddell that he couldn't resist: a trilogy fight with his old rival Tito Ortiz. For promoters, it was perfect nostalgia. Liddell had already beaten Ortiz twice in the UFC, both times convincingly. Fans remembered the rivalry as one of the sport's greatest, but this time was different. Ortiz was still active, younger, and in far better shape. Liddell, on the other hand, had been retired for years. His training clips leading up to the fight worried fans. He looked stiff, slow, and hesitant. But the Iceman, stubborn and proud, insisted he was ready. "I still have it," he told reporters. "I'm going to knock Tito out again." The reality inside the cage was heartbreaking. From the opening bell, Liddell looked like a shadow of himself. His footwork was heavy, his punches slow, his timing completely gone. Ortiz, seeing the decline up close, picked his shots carefully. In the first round, Ortiz landed a clean right hand that sent Liddell sprawling to the mat. The fight was over. Tito Ortiz had finally beaten his longtime rival, but there was no celebration, only concern. Even Ortiz admitted afterward that he felt guilty knocking out a man who clearly shouldn't have been fighting. For fans, the fight was painful to watch. The Iceman who once ruled the UFC, who terrified opponents with his icy stare, was now struggling to even move like a fighter. Analysts and former champions condemned the bout, calling it irresponsible and dangerous. Dana White, who had begged Liddell never to fight again, said afterward, "It broke my heart. He should have never been in there." The comeback that was supposed to reignite nostalgia instead cemented tragedy. Liddell wasn't just finished as a fighter. He was exposed as a man, risking his health, his dignity, and his legacy for one last payday. Fans who loved him were left conflicted, grateful for the memories, but horrified at how far he had fallen. The Tito trilogy fight wasn't just a loss on his record. It was a warning, a glaring sign that Chuck Liddell's health was in danger, that every punch absorbed was accelerating long-term damage. And yet, even after that devastating knockout, the Iceman's story didn't fade into peace. Instead, it spiraled into darker headlines, personal battles, and now, according to recent reports, a hospital bed that may represent the final chapter in his tragic downfall. After the painful 2018 comeback loss to Tito Ortiz, Chuck Liddell was supposed to fade quietly into retirement. But instead of peace, the years that followed were filled with troubling headlines that cast a shadow over his once golden legacy. The Iceman, once the stoic warrior who carried himself with quiet intimidation, now seemed caught in a whirlwind of personal chaos. In 2021, Liddell made news for reasons that had nothing to do with fighting. He was arrested at his Los Angeles home following a domestic disturbance. Although the charges were eventually dropped, the mugshot of the once proud champion, aged and weary, spread across the internet like wildfire. Fans who grew up idolizing him as the embodiment of toughness were stunned. The fighter who once represented discipline and cold composure was now another fallen star in the tabloids. It wasn't the first troubling sign. Friends and acquaintances had whispered for years about heavy drinking, nights of partying long after his fighting prime, and struggles to adjust to life outside of competition. Liddell himself admitted in interviews that the absence of fighting left a void he didn't know how to fill. The structure of training camps, the adrenaline of fight night, and the identity of being the Iceman were all gone. What remained was a man searching for meaning in a world that had moved on. Financial stress compounded the issues. With his UFC front office role terminated after the 2016 sale of the company, Liddell had no steady income. Appearances at conventions and autograph signings helped, but they couldn't sustain the lifestyle of someone who had once lived like a celebrity. For a man who headlined million-dollar pay-per-views, the reality of hustling for smaller checks was humbling and, according to some, deeply depressing. Worse still were the health rumors. Fans noted his slowed speech, his stiff movements at public appearances, and the way his once confident interviews now sounded disjointed and wandering. Experts speculated openly about CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, a degenerative brain disease caused by repeated head trauma. Liddell, who had endured countless wars and knockout losses, fit the profile, but he never confirmed anything. Like many fighters of his era, admitting weakness was out of character. All of this, the arrests, the whispers, the speculation, painted a haunting picture of a man in decline. Chuck Liddell, once the ice-cold destroyer of worlds, was now struggling with battles far more dangerous than anything he faced in the cage. Battles with loneliness, with money, with his health, and perhaps most tragically, with his own identity. And those battles were about to become even more visible as his health concerns grew too alarming to ignore. By the early 2000s and 20s, the whispers about Chuck Liddell's health had grown too loud to dismiss. Fans who spotted him at UFC events or autograph signings began posting videos online, commenting on his stiff gait, his slurred speech, and the way he often seemed dazed, even in casual conversation. It wasn't the swaggering Iceman they remembered, staring down opponents with icy calm. It was an older, slower man, struggling with the weight of years of punishment. And then came the rumors. Reports surfaced that Liddell had been hospitalized multiple times for health scares. None were confirmed, but each new sighting added fuel to the speculation that something was seriously wrong. Fans wanted answers, but there were none. His family remained quiet, his close friends offered only vague reassurances, and the UFC, the company that had once depended on him to carry the brand, said little. Now, with recent reports claiming he's been rushed to the ER and is in critical condition, those fears feel justified. The silence, the stiff movements, the slurred speech, it all points to a tragic reality. The Iceman, who once seemed unbreakable, may now be broken beyond repair. And as the world waits for confirmation, one question echoes louder than all the rest. How much did fighting, fame, and fortune truly cost Chuck Liddell?